Hi everyone, and welcome to our final week, where the big question is how history causes genocide. Obviously our main discipline this week is history, but we're also touching upon philosophy, international relations theory, and the interdisciplinary field of trauma studies, including psychoanalysis and social psychology. As usual, here's our list of objectives. Let's dive in. Does history cause genocide? This may seem counterintuitive. We'd be forgiven for thinking that history is a good thing. After all, that's the meaning behind the famous quote from George Santayana, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." It's also the meaning behind the slogan, "Never again." Never again. Surely, the social process of remembrance can produce an ethical good, but we need to problematize collective memory in order to see how history can be instrumentalized as part of the etiology of genocide. To restate this in the form of a question, how can public memory contribute to the problem of genocide? Empirically, the genocide prevention literature has demonstrated the so-called repeat offender effect. Countries with a historical record of genocide and mass atrocities are predisposed towards recidivism, as past violence left unpunished creates a permissive environment in which people become habituated to atrocity, feeding into escalatory cycles of violence. It's not surprising to see serial genocides happening over time in the same place, like how the wave of pogroms in 1919 Poland and Ukraine foreshadowed the Holocaust, for example, or how the 1994 genocide in Rwanda was preceded in the 1970s by a genocide in neighboring genocides are a risk factor for future genocides. This is an empirically demonstratable observation, to which I'll come back in the next slide. The other way of looking at the historical causes, however, is more philosophical, as it pertains to the problem of theodicy and the rationalization of evil. Theodicy is originally a theological construct that attempts to vindicate the existence of evil in light of the idea of an omnipotent deity that is supposed to have an unlimited or infinite sense of goodness. In other words, if God is ultimately benevolent, then why do bad things continue to happen in the world? Theodicy is a way of rationalizing this problem. The German philosopher Hegel explicitly endorsed such a philosophical theodicy when he argued that history was a, quote, slaughter bench at which countless peoples have been victimized at the service of what he claimed to be the teleological progress of humanity. Those countless victims of progress are enormous sacrifices, he said, towards the final aim of history. We've seen this idea before, how the keyword progress is at the center of the meta-narrative of modernity, leaving behind those in its wake as victims of the supposedly inexorable march of history. Reading one critiques such theories about the ostensibly inevitable course of human development that have been used to shore up a culture of genocide, in which the designation of certain peoples as enemies targeted for extermination is not only rationalized, but in fact legitimized as a necessary and unavoidable part of world historical evolution. This critique builds on the work of our scholar spotlight this week, Benjamin, who tragically committed suicide trying to escape the Nazis. His metaphorical angel of history, as famously inspired by this early 20th century expressionist painting, was fighting for survival in the storm we call progress. Benjamin used this image to pour scorn on the theodicies of history because they necessarily viewed the past through the eyes of its victors in order to retrospectively justify their actions and morality. So for this objective, use Benjamin's image to critique the philosophical theodicy of history. But let's put this philosophical issue to the side and go back to the earlier point about the empirical observation of history, which in turn leads us to Reading 2 by Mark Levine and his overarching historical framework. Now, the image you see here doesn't specifically pertain to genocide per se. It's a time series analysis of major battles in world history going back to 2500 BCE. It was comprised by some data scientists, so their unit of analysis isn't altogether clear. What qualifies as a major battle. There's actually a more interesting visualization of this available on Moodle, but unfortunately the GIF format doesn't easily convert into a video file, so I just used a series of screenshots for this slide. But there's a reason that I'm sharing time in certain spaces. First starting with the core of successive world systems before spreading outwards towards the peripheries. This illustrates Levine's argument, or what I call the system-level thesis, which is that the prevalence of genocide is caused by the world system itself. In other words, the world system is a root cause of modern genocide. Just like we see with these historical clusters of warfare and mass violence, Levine's multi-volume historiography identifies certain zones of genocide where specific geopolitical hotspots where genocide or near-genocidal events periodically flare up over time, giving tends to the repeat offender effect noted earlier, as places with legacies of mass violence are liable to reignite. Theoretically, Levine is also arguing that the nation-state, as a recent product of history, is the primary transmitter for modern genocides. Stated differently, the argument is that the modern form of the nation-state has a built-in risk for genocide, given its propensity for homogeneity. This argument is based on what international relations theory calls the levels of analysis problem, in which individual countries at the unit level of analysis are distinguished from the international system. The etiology of genocide doesn't stem from variation at the unit level of analysis, or what IR theory refers to as endogenic causes. As far as genocide is concerned, an endogenic approach reflects the problematic tendency to simply blame genocide on quote-unquote bad regimes and evil leaders, which in turn reflects what we called the aberration bias in week 6. What's missing from such an approach are the deeper historical connections that emanate from the world system. That is to say, genocide isn't simply caused by endogenic factors, but also by exogenic factors that are built into the system itself. Rather than an aberration, Levine's argument is that genocide is a systemic byproduct of the otherwise normal functions of the modern nation-state. This is what we can refer to as Levine's system-level thesis. We can use the bad apples metaphor to illustrate this analytical distinction between endogenic and exogenic causes. In this sense, Levine doesn't think it's a problem of bad apples per se. Rather, his argument is that the problem is with the apple barrel. So how exactly is genocide hardwired into the international system? Let's start by defining some critical terminology from IR theory. Sovereign, certain delimited territorial jurisdiction. Anything that happens inside those boundaries falls under the prerogative of the sovereign. Effectively, this gives sovereign states a license to kill. This point has been made by a number of observers. Levine, for example, references the genocide scholar from the 1980s, Leo Cooper. As well, on Moodle I've shared a clip from the British comedian Eddie Izzard, who notes that the world is apparently fine with countries committing genocide against their own people. It's when it spills over that it's a problem. This is a dark comedic take on an otherwise very serious point. This is also a point that I emphasize in my genocide class. Consider the following counterfactual. If the Nazis stopped in 1939 and World War II never happened, it's very likely that the persecution of German Jews would have been swept under the rug. How can states get away with this? It's because the international system is anarchical, meaning there's no higher authority. It's a highly competitive, Darwinistic, dog-eat-dog world out there in the realm of international relations, a Hobbesian state of nature where the threat of war is constant. The international system produces a security dilemma, where increased security measures paradoxically leads to greater insecurity. This is the permissive environment that allows for genocide. The security dilemma is compounded when you factor in the social-psychological variables of trauma. Originally, the concept of trauma was used on an individual level to explain personal experiences relating present suffering to past violence, but it's since been expanded to the collective level with notions of cultural or historical trauma. Dirk Moses' main argument in Reading 3 is that unresolved trauma is dangerous. He builds off the work of literary scholar Dominic LaCapra, who has written about how victim groups identify themselves with a certain fidelity to trauma, a feeling that one must somehow keep faith with trauma. That is to say, a sense of trauma becomes central to the identity of the victims and their progeny. This idea also relates to what we read about humiliation, the nuclear bomb of emotions. The danger here is that such fidelity to trauma could be used to foment various forms of violent extremism. Indeed, recent work in terrorism studies also shows that collective trauma and grievances are a common factor in the radicalization process. Now, this reading by Dirk Moses is theoretically a bit dense and controversial, given its stance on the Israel-Palestine conflict. Work through the intro, skim the body, but read very closely towards the end, especially on this page, where Moses begins developing his critique of memory model, in which public recognition of trauma is a zero-sum competition. The operative metaphor of the competitive memory model is the notion of real estate, where there's only a finite amount of space available for public memory, so that as one party gains, others necessarily lose. This creates very dangerous stakes for public memory, which therefore becomes an existential battle space over scarce resources. But it doesn't have to be like this. Instead, Moses is moving towards an alternative approach to memory, which elsewhere is called the multidirectional memory model. Rather than a competition over scarce real estate, the operative metaphor here is building bridges. For example, look closely at what Moses has to say about the Palestinian literary scholar Edward Said regarding the organic connection between Jewish and Palestinian experiences of suffering. It doesn't have to be a competition. Instead, there can be a mutual recognition that allows for empathetic engagement without ahistorical equivalencies. The case of the Israel-Palestine conflict is the subtext behind Reading 4, whose author was born to a Polish Jewish family that was mostly killed during the Holocaust before being relocated by the USSR to Tajikistan. In the late 1950s, Daniel Bartal immigrated to Israel, where he served as a soldier in the Israeli Defense Force before starting an academic career in social psychology in the 1970s, when he also became politically active in the Israeli peace movement. Over the past few decades, he's advanced major research programs on the social psychological foundations of peace and conflict. Reading 4 thus summarizes his recent work on the nature of intractable conflicts. This refers to protracted and chronic patterns of violence that are intergenerational and perpetuate over a long period of time. Such conflicts typically fluctuate between long periods of low-level or cold violence that are only occasionally punctuated by spikes or hot violence. To the extent that such conflicts are perceived as irresolvable and become zero-sum contests, then the risk of intractable conflicts can become existential, a matter of life and death for the in-group, and this fear often leads to genocide. In order to adapt to the conditions of intractable conflicts and to angst-ridden threat of existential annihilation, societies draw from a social psychological infrastructure that is comprised of a repertoire of cognitive and affective functions that satisfy individual and collective needs. In particular, he identifies 3 mutually interrelated elements in this infrastructure: collective memories, ethos of conflict, and collective emotional orientation. These all point towards a shared social belief structure that promotes the common social identity of a group. We're especially concerned with the collective memory element. Collective memory is a type of socially constructed narrative about the past that serves as a basis for social cohesion. In this context, the in-group constructs a narrative of the conflict that is not objective, but rather inherently biased towards the in-group. According to its self-promoting vision of history, the goals of the in-group are justified and treated as the basis of truth claims. In contrast, the out-group is depicted as having illegitimate and is posed as an absolute threat to the in-group. This is especially the case when there is a historical legacy, whether real or imagined, of victimization and trauma that becomes central to the identity of the in-group, so much so that any attempt to deviate from this collective memory is shunned or proscribed as a betrayal to the in-group. This explains how the instrumentalization of collective memory can contribute to intractable conflicts. Just like we saw with social identity theory, Bartal explains that as the in-group narrative becomes dominant, it is often complemented by an inverse process in the out-group, thereby perpetuating. Likewise, as we've seen with the perpetrator-victim paradox, this process leads to the highly subjective, biased, and/or hyperbolic constructions of victimhood. This finally leads us to Reading 5, which is a historiographical essay by Dan Stone on memory and genocide. Now, a number of important themes are covered in this piece, but focus on one issue particularly, namely how memory serves as a means of mobilization. He notes how collective memories of past sufferings are brought to bear on current crises, lending them cultural meaning as the weight of dead ancestors weighing on the minds of the living, and imbuing them with added ferocity. As he aptly states it, memory fuels genocide. For example, he looks at the case of Rwanda, as introduced last week by Mamdani, whose book, When Victims Become Killers, demonstrates how the memory of the colonial period, in which minority Tutsi domination was established according to the warped racial logic of the colonizers, was mobilized by Hutu extremists in the run-up to genocide. Likewise, Stone also discusses the memory mobilization of Serbian nationalists, which hinged upon the myths surrounding a famous 14th century battle during the invasion of the Ottoman Empire, as well as the more recent memories of entwined genocides under Nazi rule during World War II. Argument, I want to discuss a supplementary reading by Dirk Moses that analyzes this phrase, the terror of history, as an animating force in the political imaginary of genocide. This phrase is from the Romanian philosopher Mircea Eliade, who, much like Hayden White, believed that people need myths. To borrow and adapt Bartol's vocabulary from the previous slide, Eliade suggests that collective myth-making can provide a sense of ontological security for groups locked in intractable conflicts. Moses notes that Eliade was associated with Romanian fascism and harbored deep insecurities about Romanians as victims of history. As such, the phrase, the terror of history, refers to the traumatic consciousness of group subjugation or destruction. It is a social structure of feeling, a collective sentimentality reflecting a sense of annihilation anxiety, a dread of collective existential destruction of history. This sentimentality, this existential anxiety, is crucial to explaining what Moses calls the calamitization of politics. This calamitization is a potentially dangerous result of unresolved trauma, whereby any crisis in the present is depicted as a reincarnation of historical sufferings. Recall our earlier point about the instrumentalization of collective memory, and how that fits into Daniel Bartol's framework of intractable conflicts, as well as the escalatory dynamics of extremism. The terror of history concept also helps explain the preemptive security logic that we've analyzed over the past few weeks. For example, recall from last week how Strauss analyzed genocide as an anticipatory, future-oriented violence designed to achieve some sort of ideologically driven sense of security. In this context, the strategic logic of preemptive security for the future combines with an ideology based on unresolved trauma from the past. We see a very similar analysis with what Mark Levine calls the perpetrator's never again syndrome. Now, on this week's discussion forum, I'll open up a thread that analyzes the genealogy of the never again phrase, which is somewhat morally compromised, given its role in fueling certain extremist groups. The slogan never again may inspire the public good of history, but like many of the things sensibly good and normal, there's a bad side as well. Indeed, as I'll argue on my discussion thread this week, there's a potential danger in genocide prevention discourse, which may very well be implicated, even complicit, in the very problem that it intends to prevent. And on that disconcerting note, I'll finish. Now, this is our final week of the semester, so we have a lot due, in addition to our usual weekly assignments. In any case, thanks for listening, and I'll see you